I have been told that today apparently is Wednesday, which is reset day also for EU after NA. So we have gone through fully our first week of the season. I guess that was the bite-sized version, the pre-season before Mythic Raiding and Mythic Plus both became available. So with the first day still, of course, not having nearly enough, if any, of the results of Mythic Raiding available, or even Mythic Plus, really, all we can look at right before the beginning of the season is the finite results of the first week of the raid results, for example, because what will also be important to follow up on is the fact that across these past couple of days, Blizzard has piled on some extra balance tuning to certain specs and classes. Some of these have already been covered in our spreadsheet checking out the changes. So we had covered the changes ranging from the buffs of Sun Lane, Death Knight, as well as the buffs to Balance Druid as well as Feral Druid. Same goes for Resto Druid, buffs to Devastation Evoker, nerfs to Arcane Mage, buffs to Fire Mage, small buff to Mistweaver and small nerf to Windwalker, bigger nerf to Holy Paladin, as well as a pretty big buff to Shadow Priest as well. A reasonable nerf given to Outlaw, much bigger nerf given to Enhancement, finishing with a couple of buffs for Warlocks and the nerfs given to the Warrior specs. Today, this has gotten even larger with extra added tuning, which was the extra nerf given to Arcane, as well as the extra nerf given to Fury Warrior. Now perhaps the more, weird ones might have been the nerf given to Fury Warrior. Now obviously, you then look at the results of the first week of Heroic for Fury Warriors and you're like, well, clearly they are OP, just like Arcane Mage. They should both get nerfed, and also like Enhancement, which also was nerfed, and also Arms Warrior was also nerfed. And by the way, Outlaw Rogue was also nerfed. So pretty much all 6 of the specs you see here at the top have been nerfed in this reset. However, there are a few misleading things, because currently what is the bigger strength of Fury Warrior, which was correctly identified by Blizzard, was the AoE, right? Blaze Storm, Odin's Fury, that was AoE damage. And that's because, of course, what you get to see this week in Heroic, as well as something we don't really have nearly as much of a clear set of rankings like Mythic 0, was the AoE damage. Was the burst damage on mobs that have far too little HP to give you a good idea of the AoE damage certain specs can do. And while in a vacuum the AoE damage of Fury Warrior is definitely good, especially the burst damage of Fury Warrior is reasonable, it's definitely not matching many other specs. In fact, technically it is on the lower end of burst damage, not even close with specs like the Shaman specs, but also Havoc Demon Hunter and both of the DK specs. What made it shine much more this week, or we should say this last reset, was the fact that the mobs lasted approximately 7 seconds. And that's kind of good for Fury Warrior, because after those few seconds of burst, that front-loadedness, that front-loaded damage kind of goes down. Even if you look at the spread, we can say, the damage spread of the burst window of a Fury Warrior, it peaks very early. The peak burst damage happens very early, doesn't stay up for a lot, and goes down a lot. If you compare this with certain results which already are significantly higher than the ones of a Fury Warrior, like for example a Stormbringer, Elemental Shaman, and you look at their burst damage, that's quite different. That is a burst that is quite extended on multi-targets, as opposed to the one of a Fury Warrior. So when you are in Heroic Raid, where the mobs, the many adds spawning in certain fights die, in 5 to 10 seconds, that's a pretty good timer for a Fury Warrior. Meanwhile, other specs could have kept going after those 10 seconds, no problem. However, the mobs are dead. So the result was that Fury was showing far better results than others, and why it's kind of weird that this would have been nerfed. Because mobs don't have that little HP as soon as you raise the bar of the content just a little bit, which is what is going to happen this week. Now, you can be sure that mobs spawned by a boss in a Mythic Raid, or that adds in a fight, or perhaps just thrash mobs in a fortified Mythic +9 key, those are not gonna die in 10 seconds. So all of these other specs with longer and more consistent burst damage will be able to get past Fury Warrior. and then Fury will be further, damaged by these nerfs, because now that the mobs can actually survive for more than their burst window, you will get to see the strength of other specs, and now Fury will seem weaker because of these nerfs, which is why also the overall nerf by 3% wasn't perhaps particularly necessary, because it's not that Fury Warrior in pure single target was particularly strong. Even if you look at damage to all bosses, for example, Fury is already middle of the pack. If you move over, for example, to the power gains of the tier, right? Fury has one of the least. This means that this first week, or these first few 7, 8, 9, 10 days where multiple players did not have a 4-piece set bonus or even a 2-piece set bonus, they actually gained the most. They gained the most because they gained the least from their tier, which means all of these guys, as long as they don't get their hands on their tier, which is far stronger than the one of a Fury Warrior, they will be significantly weaker, right? In this first week of just Mythic 0 dungeon, Fury was practically 7% stronger than Unholy, just because Unholy doesn't have the tier set. As soon as Unholy gets the tier set, they will gain a 7% buff over Fury and even over Arms as well. So the TLDR of this whole system is to say, no, the nerf was not warranted. No, it doesn't matter if in your Mythic 0 key you got bat mad because a warrior gapped you by 20% in damage. That's expected. That is their damage profile. They have very front-loaded burst. It was supposed to happen. Now it's not going to happen anymore. In Mythic Plus keys, the higher you go, the more this will normalize, and other specs will start shining way more than a Fury Warrior. The same concept cannot be said, cannot be mentioned for Arcane. Arcane was just overperforming, period. So this nerf is more warranted overall for Arcane Mage. As you can see, even in single target, pure boss damage, they were first already, on top of including add damage, overall damage, they were still very high, so still performing very well. Warranted nerf, same goes for the other spec next to them, nerfed this week by the largest amount, Enhancement Shaman. It will be interesting to see at the beginning of this Mythic week, updated logs and even the first entries in Mythic Plus, the results of the changes of the tuning from Blizzard, because one of the highlights were the attempts of Blizzard of buffing the underperforming specs. The highlights were Balance Druid, as well as Fire Mage, as well as Shadow Priest. But even Demolock receiving a buff, even Destruction Warlock receiving a buff. So we did get, some good focus on some of the already kind of known to be weaker specs, even before we entered the actual season and we only based our possible, idea of power of the specs on the theoretical results. Our idea was that specs like Destro, specs like Demo, specs like Shadow Priest as well, they were perhaps a bit more on the weaker side before they received the buffs they have received now. So it would be nice to look at now at their results post buffs, after they have been buffed, to see if when we move into Mythic, we will actually get to see any of these improvements compared to Heroic. Obviously, you don't get to gauge much of the power from this, for example, when it comes to tanks, right? The only thing you can take a look at when looking at the Heroic Raid results when it comes to tanks isn't really, like how much damage are the tanks doing, or perhaps how much healing they are doing. That's kind of irrelevant. It's mostly just the popularity, to just try to get an idea of which specs are going to be played. Because, if a tank gets into Heroic to get gear into Heroic, then you can assume he is more likely to also get into Mythic Plus, for example, right? Or that, for example, that tank is the one that is being planned to be used in Mythic raiding, right? So, for example, if you do see 50,000 Blood Decays and 26 and 25 and 24,000 of these tanks, but only 12,000 Prot Paladins, it is kind of an educated guess that it is likely Protection Paladin won't really be seeing much of any meta states in this season compared to any one of these tanks, which is far more popular. Perhaps you could also say the same about healers as well, not just about the DPS or the tanks when looking at, even looking at the healing, which isn't the relevant part here, is mostly about the popularity, right? We see there's the Shaman, Holy Paladin, Holy Priest, there's the Druid, right? And then you see at the very bottom Mistweaver and then Discipline. So you kind of have an idea of these specs being less played than others. The only caveat obviously being Discipline, because Discipline shares a spot with Holy, and Holy is much more usable and has much better results than in Mythic raiding. So you might see this swapped around in Mythic results compared to the heroic ones, but mostly just looking at the actual results when it comes to the damage. It is interesting to take a snapshot of this result right here, so that when we get to, check 3, 4, 5, 6 days from now, the first of the results in Mythic, for example, and then we get to check the first of the results in Mythic Plus, for example, to see the performance and the popularity of the specs, how things looked in heroic. If we were able to get any good guesses from the heroic results and from the heroic popularity, or if they were red herrings, if they were complete baits compared to what's going to happen in the, let's just say in the real season, for example. Is the real season going to continue to have that many red paladins and that many affliction warlocks, as well as elemental shamans? Or as soon as you get into Mythic, as soon as you get into reasonably high level Mythic Plus keys, for example, this and this and this spec are going to disappear in favor of perhaps some of the specs being left out at the bottom of this chart of popularity? That's what was interesting in checking out the early heroic results of the DPS tanks and healers. Not to see their actual performance. Heroic is a meme, doesn't really contribute much of anything in knowing the power level of the specs. Fights last too little. Other things that can help you pad your meters, like for example add damage, burst damage, preventing other specs with longer timers in their damage windows compared to others to actually pull off their damage. So it's not really that indicative. It's mostly just to see the initial trend, to then compare it with the one in Mythic and even the popularity of the specs right now, to then compare it with the popularity of the specs once we have enough data on the tougher content, more competitive content than just Mythic Zeros, as well as the heroic raid. So this was the temporary recap for today, the final look at the heroic week, at the pre-season week before the actual release of the full season. We will see already the first few trends of the full season in a few days. What are players choosing to play? Which ones are looking to be better performing than others? But for today, on this Wednesday, we are now leaving each other, as I believe I have to actually go and raid for tonight. So thanks, of course, as usual, guys, for watching the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Starting from today, after much tinkering around with, we're actually also streaming for real, though, this time, despite still having a sore throat and trying to recover from a cold. So with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, nice. I like getting into a full reset gaming day with the background noise of the rain falling on the grass of my backyard.